Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles. Iliad, circa 8th century BCE, attributed to Homer. In context. Focus. The Greek epic. Key dates. From 2100 BCE. Versions of the first known written literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, appear in the Sumerian language. 9th century BCE. The epic Mahabharata emerges in India. After, circa 8th century BCE, attributed to Homer, the epic Odyssey contains the story of the leading figure in the Iliad, Odysseus. Circa 700 BCE. At roughly the same time as the final versions of the Homeric epics take shape, Hesiod writes the Theogony, Birth of the Gods, a poem that describes the creation of the world and the mythology of the ancient Greek gods. 1st century BCE, the Greek epic poems provided a model for Roman poets such as Horace, Virgil, and Ovid. Epics are narrative poems that recount the story of a hero who represents a particular culture. They chronicle his quests and ordeals and account for the hero's choices and motives, so hoping to establish and codify the moral principles of a society. Epics were among the earliest forms of literature in many cultures around the world. These popular stories were initially told orally and over time were embellished, reinterpreted, formalized, and finally written down, often laying the foundations of a culture's literary history. Epics usually contained many characters and genealogies and were long and complex in structure, and they were probably learned by rote in a repetitive poetic meter, or recited to a musical accompaniment, since it is far easier to memorize verse than prose. Indeed, the Greek word epic itself is derived from the ancient Greek epos, meaning both story and poem. The Homeric question. The two great ancient Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are traditionally ascribed to the poet Homer, yet little is known about him. Since the time of the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC, widely differing suggestions have been made for Homer's birth and death, place of origin, and other details of his life. Classical scholars refer to the Homeric question, which includes a number of related issues. Who is Homer? Did he ever exist? And if so, when? Was Homer the sole author of the epics, or one of a number of authors? Did the author or authors of the work originate them, or simply make a written record of poems that had been passed down orally through the generations? Many scholars argue that the epics evolved from an oral tradition and were refined and embroidered upon by multiple poets in several versions. Solid evidence is lacking, and the Homeric question is yet to be answered definitively. In ancient Greece, many epic tales were told about the Trojan War, a conflict between the Achaeans, an alliance with the Greek states, and the city of Troy. The first and most famous of these accounts were the Iliad and Odyssey, both attributed to a single author known as Homer. Historians concede that these epics were inspired by actual events. Sporadic wars between Greece and Troy did occur some 5 centuries before the works were written, but their characters and plots are the works of the imagination. However, the Greeks of Homer's era would have believed these stories to be true accounts of the heroism of their ancestors. The Greeks began to write down their epics around the 8th century before the Christian era. Like the spoken tales on which they were based, they took the form of narrative poems. These Greek epics have a regular meter. Each line is comprised of 6 basic rhythmic units, and each of these units contains 1 long and 2 short syllables. This meter is known as a dactylic hexameter, or more commonly, epic meter. Variations on this basic rhythmic pattern give the flexibility needed for poetic composition. The Greeks and Trojans were helped or hindered by the gods, who used the conflict to fight their own battles. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon were aligned with the Greeks, while Apollo, Aphrodite, and Artemis supported the Trojans. Zeus remained largely neutral. Drink deep of battle, the Iliad. A tale of gods and men. The Iliad is a sophisticated piece of storytelling. It relates the tale of the war in Ilium, Troy, from the perspective of one character in particular, Achilles. Parts of the story of the war are told in flashback or in prophecies of the future. Woven into this plot are subplots and insights into the lives of the protagonists. How much of this complexity can be credited to Homer, and how much is a result of refinement and embroidering over previous generations is impossible to tell. The result is a work that combines history, legend, and mythology while offering the essential ingredients of good storytelling, adventure, and human drama that make it a compelling read. The Iliad is massive, both in its length and its narrative scope. It is, after all, where we get the idea of things being on an epic scale. Consisting of over 15,000 lines of verse divided into 24 books. Rather than simply telling the tale chronologically, Homer grabs the reader's attention by using the device common to many epics. This is to drop the reader straight into the thick of the action, or in media res, the middle of the thing, as described in the Roman poet Horace. Homer's already been raging for 9 years. Homer just digresses to explain some of the background or the events he is describing. But he assumes much prior knowledge about the causes of the conflict which contemporary readers would have known well. Troy was believed for many years to be a mythical city. However, archaeologists now agree that excavations in Anatolia, Turkey, have revealed the story of Homer's Iliad. Origins of the war. The roots of the Trojan War can be found in events that occurred at the wedding of the sea nymph Thetis to the hero Peleus, who was a companion to the hero Hercules. The celebrations were attended by many gods and goddesses, including Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. An argument broke out between the three goddesses, each of them claimed to be the most beautiful. To resolve the dispute, Zeus asked Paris, the son of King Priam of Troy, to judge a beauty contest between them. Aphrodite offered Paris a bribe, the hand of Helen, Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world. Unfortunately, Helena was already married to Menelaus, brother of King Agamemnon, a Greek state. The subsequent abduction of Helen by Paris triggered the conflict. Years during the narrative when Agamemnon's Achaean forces are fighting to recapture Helen. The book's opening, Single Goddess, the Anger of Achilles, sets the scene, preparing the reader for a story of war, but also implies that this is a tale of personal vengeance, and alludes to the involvement of the gods. The history of the war runs in parallel with Achilles' story, and a sense of honor and battle mirrors that of the Greek nation itself. Victory passes back and forth between men. Iliad. The power of anger. Anger is a predominant theme in the Iliad, manifests in the war itself, and as the motivations for the actions of the individual characters. There is the righteous anger of Agamemnon and Menelaus over the kidnapping of Helen, but also the wrath that drives Achilles and makes him such a fearsome warrior and provoked again and again by the events in the story. His anger is not directed solely at the Trojans, nor even restricted to human foes. At one point, he is so enraged he fights the river god Xanthus. Underlying the wrath of Achilles is a sense of honor and nobility which, like that of the Greek people, is offended by disrespect and injustice, but is sometimes directed inward as he struggles with the conflicts that arise between duty, destiny, ambition, and loyalty. At the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles becomes enraged by King Agamemnon, the Greek commander who has taken for himself Briseis, a woman who had been given to Achilles as a prize of war. Unable to vent his anger toward the king directly, Achilles withdraws to his tent, refusing to fight anymore. Only the death and action of his close friend Patroclus at the hands of Hector, the eldest son of the king Priam, at the hands of the Trojans, brings him back to battle and more violently than ever, giving him a focus for his anger. A tale of two heroes. Hector is like Achilles, a military leader. He is considered the noblest and mightiest of the Trojan warriors, but his character and motivation stand in contrast to those of Achilles, highlighting two very different attitudes to war. Achilles is driven by anger and by an inner rage, but also the noble motives of defending the honor of his king and country, and ultimately avenging the killing of Patroclus, his comrade in arms. Hector fights out of loyalty to Troy, of course, but also to his family. In addition to being protective of his younger brother Paris, whose abduction of Helen has caused the war, he is loyal to his father Priam, who is portrayed as a wise and benevolent king. Achilles is a professional soldier with few family ties, and Hector, the reluctant but fierce fighter defending home and family rather than honor. Homer portrays both men as noble, but not without their flaws. The characteristics and situations are metaphors for the contrasting values of society and those of the individual, and those of duty and responsibility compared with loyalty and love. Neither side is wholly right or wrong, but in this war, one must emerge victorious. Even though both heroes ultimately die in the conflict, Achilles slays Hector and is himself killed by a fatal arrow in his heel. It is the heroism personified by Achilles that wins out over Heron's bonds of kinship. Ultimately, the Iliad affirms there is glory in warfare and that honorable reasons exist for fighting. The warriors Hector and Achilles have contrasting personalities and motivations, which provide recurrent themes in Homer's examination of the heroic ideal, destiny, and the gods. Homer knew that his readers, the Greeks, were aware of the outcome of the story because if Troy had won the war, there would have been no Greek civilization. The Greeks were destined to win and reinforce this inevitability. Homer makes reference to many prophecies throughout the Iliad, and to the role of fate and the gods in deciding the war's outcome. To the ancient Greeks, the gods were immortals who had dominion over certain realms and possessed certain powers. They were not the omnipotent deities of later beliefs. Occasionally, they interacted with humans, but generally left them to their own devices. In the Iliad, however, several of the gods trust in the Trojan War from time to time. The war had, after all, been triggered by the abduction of Helen, the daughter of Zeus and Leda. Paris had seized Helen in collusion with Aphrodite, so sides had already been taken on Mount Olympus, the home of the gods. There were also other connections between the gods and the mortals. Thetis, for example, was not nymph, but also the mother of Achilles. Such allegiances prompted the gods to intervene in human affairs, protecting their favorites from harm and making life difficult for their enemies. Apollo, in particular, is fiercely anti-Greek and causes them trouble on several occasions. For example, when Patroclus goes into battle disgusted as Achilles, by wearing Achilles' famously protective armor, Apollo contrives to dislodge it of his best friend. Achilles vows vengeance, and again, incensed by the death of his best friend, Achilles vows vengeance, and again the gods intervene. His immortal mother Thetis presents him with a new suit of divine armor, specially forged by the god Hephaestus.